60 knots.
Check.
V1. Rotate.
Are the mics on?
The mics are on. Welcome, everyone, to episode 12 of the Blue Skies podcast. Today, we're diving into a pretty fascinating side of aviation that we haven't done yet, so I'm definitely excited for this episode. It's one that combines neuroscience, human factors and human performances, and kind of the science behind how we fly. So our guest today is Dr. Naila Ayala, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo and a researcher at the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Aeronautics. And we did have Dr. Suzanne Kearns a few episodes ago who kind of introduced WISA. So it's nice to have you with us, Naila. Your work looks at how pilots think and see and react under pressure using different technologies, which I guess you'll talk about and we'll dive into. So it's pretty cool to just see how you get to understand what pilots do in the flight deck. What's also neat is that Dr. Naila Ayala's research focuses on low-time pilots. So it's stages that many of us or our listeners are in or remember being in. So that'll kind of contribute to some of the factors of how cognitive load and stress and kind of visual attention, how it impacts our performance. So Dr. Ayala, welcome to Blue Skies. It's definitely a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah. How about you tell us a bit about your journey, what first interested you in neuroscience and how that kind of led you to aviation?
Yeah. So it's a long but really funny story. So I started my journey with neuroscience specifically at Western University, and I was starting to look at concussions coming out through sports just because that was a major passion of mine.
Yeah.
I dealt with a lot of concussions when I was younger, and that's kind of what introduced me to neuroscience and specifically eye tracking. So during that period of time, we were looking at how can we use eye tracking, which looks at how our eyes move, because a lot of the science behind it is that our eyes are almost a window into our brain and what we're processing and how we use that information to actually carry out goal-directed behaviors. So we started with that. And then once I finished that project up, which gave us a lot of insight into how brain function was impacted in a very negative way coming out from a sports-related concussion, I went over to Dr. Eva Nieuwsvedel's lab at the University of Waterloo, where I was hoping to continue my work in concussions. But with the pandemic, concussion research ended up being a very high-risk group. And so that would have actually prolonged my PhD journey quite a bit. And at the time, WISA was actually basically being born. And my supervisor was one of the supporters of that research initiative. And so she thought it would be great to sort of pick up the scientific backbone of what I was doing with concussion research and apply it to pilots. And the way that we kind of did that was instead of looking at using eye movements to see what's wrong with the brain, we looked to see, can we have eye movements dictate what's right with the brain, or can we optimize brain function in these high stress, high domain environments, with aviation pretty much being the top of, high stress, high risk environments. And so that's where my journey in aviation began. And it's actually a nice way for me to get into this domain because on my journey of doing research in aviation, I talked to my parents quite a bit about it. And my dad was like, oh, I actually wanted to be a pilot when I was younger and I never got the chance. And so it's been really nice to kind of do research in this type of environment where I'm able to talk to pilots a lot, learn a lot about aviation, and then just talk to my parents about it a lot and just share that with them. But that's kind of what got me into aviation initially. And through my PhD research, PhD is really long, super stressful, super tedious and demanding type of program to get through. And to be completely honest, if you're going into a PhD, it's because you love doing science. You have to be passionate about the topic that you're actually studying. And with this pivot, I found this passion that I never thought I would have in aviation. And that's kind of rooted me even going forward into a postdoc and looking at careers that really continue to look at applying this cool science to pilot training, to improving the way that pilots behave in the skies and take care of, all the different types of tasks that they're doing at any given moment. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into it.
So you had no aviation background at all until this?
Or like you didn't even see yourself going into aviation, it just happened by chance.
Exactly. Yeah. And in the first year actually of of jumping and pivoting the research into aviation, I ended up taking one of those introductory flights.
Okay.
And I just instantly fell in love. And I was like, I kind of want to get my license at this point. So, I'm kind of putting money aside because we all know how expensive it is to kind of get even like a PPL license to kind of go through that because it's awesome.
Yeah. No, that's okay. Were you like sitting there like analyzing the person that took you? Like, oh, where are they looking? What's going on with their body language?
A little bit. Yeah. It was early enough on where like I myself also didn't know as much as I currently know right now.
Yeah.
So I think if I was to do that again, I would definitely be analyzing them much more. But at the time, the only thing that I was thinking was, if I have enough money to actually go through this route and get a license, I want to be putting an eye tracker on every single time I'm in the cockpit because that would be so telling of so many different things that I'm sure my research also speaks towards.
Yeah. I guess you could see it all the way from like the beginning of your training to the end of your training, how it develops. And how did you get this idea? So you said initially you were kind of studying, the negative aspects, but what sparked that idea? Like, oh, maybe I could find a benefit from my research. And then that shifted into aviation, like, oh, let's find the highest risk scenario possible and apply my research to this. What flipped that switch?
That's a really good question. I think as researchers, when you kind of jump into a new field of research that seems to be very exploratory, you tend to want to go after some very low-hanging fruit in the sense of like, what are the biggest demands on an individual and how can we showcase that there are differences or changes to whatever it is you're studying that we should continue looking at. And so with aviation, I think the easiest thing to look at would be, okay, so if we're looking at the way people are processing information, how does that differ from somebody who hasn't, had their very first hour of flight versus somebody who has 1,000 hours of real aircraft experience? That would be one of the biggest differences we could study to start to establish some differences right off the bat. Some of the other ways we could study, and we have studied it, is with these low-time aviation pilots or even pilots who are currently training to, say, get their first level certification. If we throw a very complicated scenario that involves being able to detect hazards or things that are unexpected in their environment, how does that impact their ability to actually maneuver the aircraft and safely land? Because I think, as your listeners know and as you guys know, it takes time and practice to be able to carry out certain maneuvers efficiently without becoming overly stressed or having, these bouts of cognitive overload that then impact your ability to respond properly and to respond timely. And so those were kind of two of the biggest questions that we instantly jumped into to kind of see what is there to study, what are the differences, and how is that being characterized in the way that people are actually processing things.
Hearing it from you now and learning about what you do, it makes a lot of sense, like the basic idea of what you do. Like, why isn't this being researched before? But before this came up to my mind, I never thought about it once. Now that you explain it, it makes a lot of sense. And it feels like there's probably a lot more in this region to be able to research that you guys are just kind of starting off into now.
I think the biggest thing that also makes this almost like this big blue ocean of research that needs to be studied is because of the development in technology, right? So in the past 10 years, maybe, or 15 years, there's been this huge push and this huge change in the eye tracking technology itself. So before this, we had these clunky head tracking eye trackers that would not be feasible to study, pilot behaviors in a simulator, let alone in an actual aircraft. But now we've got these glasses that are basically like, a pair of sunglasses or regular eyeglasses that people can throw on, put a phone in their back pocket, and they can kind of go about whatever they need to do. And we can track all the exact same information, almost to the same quality as those big clunky head-fixed eye trackers that we used to have and that currently are still gold standard in research. But it's really opened the door for us to really look at these more important questions in a much more real-world type of environment, which is really important.
I also noticed that, like you mentioned, like technology is definitely exponentially grown or I guess advanced in the last 10 to 15 years. But I feel like even just eye tracking devices, like we've seen a lot more of them with the Meta glasses and the Apple Vision Pros and things like that, that just move and are based off of eye tracking movement, which is pretty wicked to see how it applies to your field and how it's just amazing for research. You mentioned doing your PhD is such a demanding part of your education and your career. How do you balance that plus the research you do with WISA and any personal time and social time? How does that kind of fit in?
Honestly, it's an ongoing challenge, I want to say. Everyone tries to strive for balance, and I think balance may look different to different people. And for what I've found that works for me and my family and like my partner at home is that I go through these ebbs and flows in research and in work and, and stuff like that. And so I think it's been really helpful to have those people that I care about in my environment, both friends and family, that understand that there are going to be those really crazy periods of time, which may be a couple of weeks, maybe like 2-3 months, where work is unfortunately going to dominate a good chunk of my time. But then there'll be these ebbs in this cycle where it's like it's much more laid back. I have a lot more extra time. And that's where I really prioritize like family time with my partner, trying to just get to all these other facets of life that aren't surrounded by academics and work. Because, I think it's way too hard to try and figure out another way to balance everything all at the exact same time, unless you're okay with things sort of being done at a slower pace, which, I mean, that could work for some people. It just unfortunately doesn't work for me. But it's definitely an ongoing challenge.
No, it's pretty neat to kind of know about your background. So the next portions of kind of our questions apply directly to kind of what you study and what you've been finding lately. We've noticed from some research of yourself that your publications relate to the background of, again, many of our listeners, so low-time pilots. One study that we looked at that particularly stood out to us, and I guess the podcast, is the effects of task difficulty on gaze behavior during landing with visual flight rules in low-time pilots. So that sounds like a mouthful, but I think every chunk of that title there is really interesting. So how about you walk us through one of your projects, or maybe that one in particular, and what you've discovered about how pilots process information or manage cognitive load?
I'm really happy you picked that publication because that was almost the cornerstone of this one signal that I discovered that played a pretty important role in the rest of my PhD trajectory and how I kind of designed research studies after that. We had not gotten the ALSIM simulator yet. And so just to kind of test the feasibility of what we wanted to study, we started off with Microsoft Flight Simulator on a desktop. So we got a couple of controls to mimic the yoke and the throttle. We didn't get any rudder pedals because we thought that was a little too much for this initial approach. But what we wanted to look at was if we made the challenge of landing a little more complex by adding in significant crosswinds, what would that do to gaze behavior? And we were curious about this specifically because we manipulated the winds only, but the visual environment stayed the exact same, which may not be pretty, reflective of what I'm sure you guys face out on a sky when it's beautiful, bright, sunny day with no winds versus another day that may be still kind of nice, but there's significant, crosswinds or turbulence that you have to deal with. But it was important for us to keep the visual environment the exact same because if there was no change in the visual environment, then the changes that we saw in gaze behavior specifically would really speak to the different information you process when handling some much more challenging demands, which came through the crosswinds. And so in that specific study, we manipulated 50% of the landing trials. So we had 20 trials. 10 of them were very easy landing scenarios where it was bright sunny day, no crosswinds. The other 10 trials were of another bright sunny day, but significant crosswinds that you had to deal with. And we looked at how low-time pilots were able to land during those different scenarios and how that changed their gaze behavior. And what we found was that even though landing performance tended to be pretty similar, which is great, obviously we want that, what the gaze behavior demonstrated was a number of different things that pointed to how task difficulty, namely through weather conditions, impacted the way that these pilots were processing information. And so when something becomes a little harder, what we saw was that their attention was much more focused on task-relevant areas of interest. And it was the most task-relevant areas that we saw got more time devoted to it. So you would think things like the runway got a lot more time devoted to it. The airspeed indicator got a lot more time devoted to it. The power indicator got a lot more time devoted to it. And there's a couple of other regions that had less time devoted to it just because it wasn't as critical to the task at hand. And so that was one of the biggest findings from that. And the second one that I was super proud of was, this goes back towards, the whole aspect of doing a PhD. You spend all this time doing all this data collection, and you're just looking at data for hours on hours, days at a time. And you're looking to establish changes in this signal that you're trying to process. And what I found in this signal was that not only were there changes in the different areas of interest that got more time attended to it, there was a change in the way that people were switching from the runway to the other areas of interest within the cockpit. And this became more apparent in individuals that had fewer hours of time in an actual aircraft, where they became very fixated on things within the cockpit, and they stopped switching from outside to inside and outside to inside. And I think what a lot of your listeners and even you guys or even other pilots would very much say is something that is bad to do is to stop scanning both inside and outside the environment, especially in VFR conditions. And so to be able to find that in the signal, to objectively say, hey, you kind of have to snap out of it and look outside and kind of cycle a bit more was really, it was awesome for me, because that signal has, or at least that type of behavior has been reported in research, but only anecdotally. So a lot of researchers would say, hey, we noticed that under these conditions, these types of pilots would just stop cycling through their environment and all the different airways, and they just become super fixated. But now we have this data and this cool way of showing that objectively, at this point in time, this pilot stopped cycling for this amount of time. And that was able to not only tell us when they would stop cycling, but how frequently, how often, and how that would later impact their ability to, say, be able to look out for hazards in the environment, which is really crucial.
So sorry, I might have missed this, but is it the low time pilots that you've noticed in this research would stop cycling, or was it a particular demographic, or was it everyone that you kind of...
So when we did some more exploratory analysis and breaking up groups within that first study, it was more pilots that had 0 to 20 hours of flight versus pilots who had already had their license either at the PPL or CPL level. And so that exploratory analysis, because it was really preliminary, we didn't set up the study to specifically look at these two groups of pilots, then gave us the indication of hey, something interesting is happening here, not only across what the rest of the research has actually shown us, but within this particular signal that we're looking at right now. So we should devise another study that actually looks at these group differences to be more powerful to actually speak to that.
So what was the conclusion of at which point people will generally tend to stop scanning? Does that become a high risk scenario? Is it 20 feet over the runway, they just get locked in and they can't look at anything else, and then risk increases? What was the conclusion in that sense?
That's a good question. We didn't look at the data to actually answer that type of question. What we did see was that there was this last period of time, I want to say probably, when pilots were about 20 seconds away from contacting the runway, where all pilots were solely looking outside the runway. And our indicator of saying whether or not they had stopped cycling would go off. And that's almost true for every pilot, no matter if you have 0 hours or 1,000 hours. But I think that's really important for that specific phase of flight. Mm-hmm. What we did find was that throughout the entire duration of, say, once you finish your base and you turn onto your final approach of landing, during that entire period, individuals who are less experienced tend to have more of those periods of time where they would stop cycling versus more experienced individuals. And what was more important for us was that when we started to look at, say, the scenarios where individuals who had crashed, and we looked at that same signal, we saw that even as far as in the downwind section of the approach, they had started showing these periods of time where they would stop cycling, and that probably played a big role in their inability to do a number of different things that would help them have a nice, clean final approach that resulted in them crashing. But there's still more research that has to go into that to actually be able to support that claim. But that's just some of the stuff we initially saw.
I see, like some preliminary thoughts and theories.
Yes.
And it's already very interesting, like to hear that part of it in itself. Like in aviation, if there ever is like crash or something like that, there's always a chain of reasons that leads up to that. And you guys are kind of finding one of them.
Absolutely.
Slowly. So I should be telling my students to keep scanning. Keep scanning. Don't fix it. Keep outside in, outside in, outside in.
What about the transition from an approach to actually the landing phase? What does that look like? Is there a right or wrong way to kind of transition? I guess there's no concrete answer that we were given as students, but at some point you've got to, like when you're flaring or you're rounding out, at some point you just switch and you're now looking outside because you're obviously landing the aircraft. Is there a right or wrong answer that you found in your research that that's when you should stop scanning and you should be solely fixated outside?
That's a really good question. I don't think there's anything that I've looked at in the research that can tell us conclusively yes or no. But to your point of, when you guys were probably being taught, and even today, for us as researchers, when we were trying to understand how pilots perform and what kind of defines like the perfect landing or the perfect approach or the perfect time to flare and when you should be looking here, and there, we didn't really find much, even from Transport Canada, with respect to like hard measures that we can use to then say, hey, this is the benchmark. This is what everyone else is kind of measuring up against. And I think that's what's made our role as researchers at WISA so important, because obviously Transport Canada has done an amazing job in establishing what is a safe landing and what things need to be set in place before you can land versus, say, call a go around or do anything else. But I think there's still a lot of questions for us as researchers and probably as students, for those who really want in their head, like at this point in time, I have to do this. And at this point in time, I have to do that. So that's made it really interesting for us to try and figure out if there's even a benefit to having these very strict measures for each of these different phases in place.
When I was learning, I was definitely that student that was like, at this point you do this, at that point you do this, and then you start doing, like, I needed to know step by step what's the process. But I think through my training is where I realized that you're right, there is no right answer. To me, it was always like a perfect landing should look like this, but what I did is not a perfect landing. But it's not until now where I'm kind of in the career force and I fly in northern Manitoba, like northern provinces, where we have a lot of challenging runways. And so a perfect landing, in my mind, one day would have been, right on the main wheels and very smooth, buttered landing. But in certain conditions, you actually do want to plant it down and be firm because you want it to stop or whatever. So I guess you're right. It is very ambiguous to define what a perfect landing is. And I can see how that would maybe make it difficult to research certain things. I see that you're heavily focused on kind of eye tracking, and it goes to show what you had introduced in the beginning, where visual acuity is kind of a big reason into why your brain does what it does. But what about the other aspects of body language and just kind of physiological factors when you're flying, whether it be your listening skills or what your heartbeat's doing? Have you guys kind of researched that?
So during my postdoc, one of the reasons why I wanted to continue doing research was because eye tracking is superb for giving us a lot of information about how, mentally we are processing things in the environment. But to your point, there's a lot of other things assigned with, being a pilot that go beyond, what it is that you're processing with your eyes. There's two people that have to be in cockpits of the much larger planes, right? And so it goes beyond what you yourself are trying to do. You have to be able to communicate and listen to your partner effectively. And that's been shown with a lot of the other industry stuff that I've been sort of touch and go with. We've been looking at things like how voice analytics plays a role in cognitive load between a first officer and a captain. We've looked at a number of other different physiological indicators like heart rate variability, and other things that we can get from, galvanic skin responses, let's say, that really speak to this much more holistic picture of what's going on in a human's body when they're responding to very anxiety-provoking or stressful scenarios. That becomes much more apparent when you're working with, a co-captain or a first officer right beside you. So that's kind of the focus of what we're trying to do now. So we're working with a couple of other researchers in WISA who have ongoing collections going on at a number of different training organizations that is not only having people wear eye trackers in an aircraft, but they're strapping them on with a heart rate monitor. They're strapping them on with an EEG, sort of sweatband looking apparatus. So we've got all these signals coming in that we're hoping to continue doing research on in terms of how to effectively collect it all, how to analyze it all, how to actually make it make sense to hopefully an instructor one day, or as a nice, self-learning tool, so that once you're done your session, you can either go back to the debrief room and talk about it, or you can go back home and replay through the session and be able to use those insights to say, hey, during this important time of when I was doing my, steep turn or when I was landing, I was super anxious, and it was because I wasn't paying attention to X, Y, and Z, or I wasn't doing some specific action appropriately. So that's kind of the goal of what we're hoping to do. But as of right now, that's the main reason why I'm continuing to do work with WISA.
What are some of the biggest human factor challenges that you've seen in kind of current pilot training or cockpit technology that your research is maybe tackling?
Two of the biggest ones are looking at cognitive load. Obviously, we know what you guys do up in the skies is very cognitively demanding. So trying to understand that and see how we can introduce technology to offload some of those tasks so that your job becomes a little more easier, or you're able to devote more attentional resources to unexpected events that may happen, is something where a lot of our research is looking towards. I think the same goes towards situation awareness. Obviously, that's a very important soft skill that all pilots need to develop and hone over their time. And that's some of the things that we are trying to tackle with eye tracking. I think there's an interesting debate going over this right now into how powerful eye tracking can be as a tool to actually speak towards situation awareness. Because situation awareness, as far as, Ensley has defined it, is broken down into these 3 levels of perception, comprehension, and being able to predict what then would happen to your future goals in the environment. And eye tracking can really speak to maybe the first and the second level, but it's really hard to deduce if you as a pilot, through your eye movements, we can actually say that you understand what could potentially happen if this small thing on your radar ends up coming into your flight path.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of other research questions that definitely need to be answered, and maybe potentially more sensors that needs to be added to be able to effectively monitor things like that. But those would be the 2 biggest ones. And I think the last one has to do with, automation constantly being a factor that pilots have to be aware of and be able to manage properly. And because things continue to become more automated, it really changes the way that you guys are trained to sort of deal with that. And so that's probably another factor or another prong of research that we're devoting some time to, because obviously that impacts not only the way that you operate, but the way that training should be almost like modernized in a sense.
Theoretically, would you be able to tell someone's skill level by putting them in the simulator and just tracking where their eyes are? If you put Trisha and I in the simulator, could you tell us who's a better pilot?
I think we have to build in a couple of assumptions. So if we were to take you guys into the simulator and know we'd be matching the cockpits that you guys are currently operating in, we would be probably matching the environments you guys are typically navigating in, then theoretically we could tell whether or not you are lower on your training journey versus much more experienced on your training journey. But to actually put a number, or like, hey, you are novice or intermediate or expert for sure, I don't think we're there yet.
What a polite way to put it. Like how experienced you are. I guess it makes sense because we just talked about how ambiguous defining certain limits in aviation are. Like we don't even know what a perfect landing is, so it's hard to kind of define who's a better pilot. We'll leave it at that.
How do you feel supported while doing your research? It sounds like you have a good team that you work with and a good mentor, I presume, as well as you go through this.
Absolutely. I can't say enough good things about the University of Waterloo and WISA in general. I think the supervisor I had and currently have, and the surrounding team members and other co-collaborators that make up WISA right now, they're just so driven to empower their trainees at the grad level to do good science and then be able to communicate those findings to an impactful level to any organization. And that, I think, is what made it all the difference, is that in doing that, they were so supportive. They were so positive about the impact that this could have. And they were just great at just bringing me up as mentors and giving me different opportunities, even within the university, to present things, to try and collaborate with new people, to try and do new projects with all these resources that they had at, their fingertips, that it allowed me to really hone in on, my presentation skills, on my ability to do all these different types of things with the cool sensors we had in the simulator, and just grow as a researcher and as someone who could translate these findings into industry.
Are you currently a mentor to other grads or other people in your team?
I am to some people in my research lab and other researchers within the WISA community. I feel like I would like to push myself to be a mentor to those outside of that community, just because of the sheer amount of opportunities that WISA has provided me. I think I have a lot to, tell about, people going down this type of pathway or wanting to be going into aviation in general that may not be through the lens of a pilot, that I could definitely help support in one way or another. But yeah, I think it goes back to that whole aspect of balance too, is you can't give all your time to all these different things. At some point you have to learn how to say no, which I'm getting a little better at. At first I was terrible at it.
A few of the guests that we've had come on so far have said saying no is a skill you have to learn, and they were all bad at it at the start. And then they eventually figured it out.
So as a mentor then, as an aspiring mentor, how would you suggest that pilots actually build awareness of their own cognitive or motor skills and performances? Like you mentioned that you have some apparatus that you're hoping are accessible to people to the point where they can do their own kind of debrief. But since we're not at that point yet, how can they kind of self-monitor and improve?
That's a great question. I think it's hard to give any advice to that at this point in time for, your cognitive type of processes, just because we are so far away from having any type of monitoring device for that. I would like to say that at some point you can have something not like an actual Apple Watch, but a type of tool like some of these smart wearable devices that'll say hey, maybe today you didn't meet your movement goal, but tomorrow if you try doing this and this and this, you might be able to get there. But for pilots and, their scanning, that would be awesome. I think all the advice I could give right now is that in the back of your mind, when you are up in the sky and you find yourself becoming way too hyperfixated on something, just have a note in the back of your mind saying, hey, maybe I should just do a brief scan of everything right now and see what's going on. Other than that, I think the closest things that we have to providing additional resources is, maybe working with Waterloo Wellington to developing a library of different scan patterns of, instructor pilots or expert level pilots for all these different types of aircraft, so that, trainees can just go through them and just watch how they're actually paying attention to different things in their environment, how they're scanning things when they're doing a steep turn, when they're actually doing their final approach. Because there has been some research that has shown if I give you a video recording of what, the perfect scan pattern is, and you watch that over and over again, at some point it'll kind of click with you and it'll run with you as you're actually up in the sky, and it'll improve the way that you're scanning, which is awesome. So that would be like the first quick thing that I think we could develop for trainees out there, to just be like, I can't really change much up in the way that I'm doing things right now, but if I maybe just kind of pay attention to these videos, at some point it'll click for me and I'll get into the rhythm of what I should be attending to. Yeah.
That's true. With technology nowadays, compared to just 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we have the ability to watch someone do something that we're trying to learn. So if I want to learn how to shoot a basketball, instead of figuring it out myself, I could go watch a YouTube video and copy it to the best of my ability, which will speed up that learning process exponentially.
Exactly.
And I guess that's the path that you guys will be taking soon, maybe, if that's part of your plan.
Yeah, definitely. I think what's also exciting too is, this whole jump in VR and its application to all these different types of industries, including, just having it for fun, is that some of the research has shown that we've done through WISA that, using even desktop simulators like my Microsoft Flight Simulator, or playing in a VR version of, say, Microsoft Flight Simulator, could actually do a very good job of expediting your process in learning very specific things. Let me be clear on that. Things like checklists and flows. But when it comes to other, more hands-on maneuvers, like steep turns, actually landing, learning how to take off, that stuff still seems to be rooted in needing an actual simulator or actual aircraft time to be devoted towards that. But, it's great to have all these new technologies come up in ways that can expedite certain pockets of your training.
Yeah.
It seems that there's a lot of ways this can go, a lot of branches. Are you and your team focused on a certain path right now?
So I know, my previous supervisor, Dr. Neuroscience, she's very focused on how can we use gaze to optimize training. So very much going back to that idea of, if we record a whole library of different videos of different tasks in aircraft with the instructor pilot's gaze superimposed to show me what I'm supposed to do, how much will that actually improve my scanning? How much time will that take off from me achieving my PPL certification or my CPL certification? How can that transfer to even, say, a commercial airline level? So she's very much focused on how can gaze help improve that aspect of pilot training. You have other researchers, like my co-supervisor for my postdoctoral fellowship, Dr. Shirt Tsao. He is very focused on using these types of technologies like VR, or introducing all these different types of signals to identify when pilots are getting stressed or how their cognitive load is changing. How can we use those signals to then build a machine learning model that will indicate to your instructor, hey, these are the gaps that we saw during this training session that the pilot has to focus on. So maybe have a more detailed feedback debrief on XYZ, which is also really important, but that's a little bit different from gaze behavior. I am falling more into that latter type of research stream just because I've got 1 foot in academia and 1 foot in industry. And so being able to see how that application can then, feed into different businesses in the aviation industry right now that are hoping to develop these types of tools is very much an easy step away. So that's currently kind of the focus that I've got, but you have a bunch of other researchers focused on all these different types of human factors and how, they impact human performance that as a whole will definitely move, research forward, and hopefully will impact, or at least drive, some of the changes that Transport Canada will eventually make with respect to pilot training in a direction that obviously is just as safe, if not safer, than what we currently have.
Well, I've learned a lot about what you do, and I think it's fascinating. But what I'm even more excited is kind of the next few questions that I have, which I think kind of apply to what our organization does and whatnot, but more so the masculine versus feminine side of pilots and their cognitive abilities, so to say. So again, you've done some fascinating research comparing males and female pilots with similar flight hours, ratings, same demographic, I guess. What inspired you to look into that area, and what were you hoping to understand?
In the back of our minds, we've known that female aviators make up such a small portion of the total workforce, and understanding why that's the case has always been, important to us, whether that's a cultural, barriers that women are having to deal with, or their actual performance barriers that women are having to deal with. So all of those different types of things are important for us to understand as researchers, and I'm sure as, aviators in general. And the reason why we were able to finally study this, at least at an exploratory level, was because in the second study I ran during my PhD, we happened to receive so many recruitment requests from female aviators to the point where I was like, hey, we can actually run like a female versus male study. And instantly my supervisor was like, great, let's do it. Let's see what the data shows. And this study was so interesting from a number of different respects because we had a bunch of hypotheses. Some of them were supported by the data, some of them were not supported by the data. But what was more interesting was that some of the hypotheses associated with, gender differences in males and females from a neurocognitive standpoint, we didn't end up seeing any evidence of that. And so if I get specifically into some of the results of our one gender study, we had pilots that were hour matched and license matched come in. So that's probably the most controlled you can get for, looking at gender differences within aviation. And we want to see how they approached these similar task modifications that we ran, which was, we have a nice sunny day with no winds. We have a nice sunny day with significant crosswinds. And we, of course, always throw in at some point a surprise emergency scenario. And so we wanted to see how they performed. We wanted to see how their gaze behavior differed. And we wanted to just understand, even from a, self-report perspective on situation awareness, how these pilots differed based on their gender. And what we saw was that we were hoping to see a lot of differences actually in the gaze behavior, and no gender differences came out from the gaze behavior, which was interesting because based on what we were thinking and the same line of thinking coming from, previous neurocognitive studies that studied gender differences, was that we should see differences related to the way that females process information versus the way males process information. So what we thought we were going to see was that female pilots would have a much more broader allocation of their visual gaze behavior across, within the gauges in the cockpit and across the exterior windows, that being the runway and all the other things out in their environment. Whereas males tend to be much more focal on the way that they sort of direct their attention. And so that would have been a little more evident with having less dispersed gaze behavior. And we didn't see that, which was interesting. And because we didn't see that, we weren't able to pinpoint differences in gaze behavior that then supported the differences in performance that we saw. Because where we ended up seeing the biggest performance differences in the male and female pilots was not during the easy scenario, not during the significant, crosswind scenario, but in the emergency scenario. So in this high stress task, what we saw was that female pilots were able to process that there is an emergency significantly faster than their male counterparts. They landed the plane significantly quicker in a safe manner than their male counterparts. And in doing so, they were able to control their airspeed significantly better while navigating all of that than their male counterparts. But without the gaze data showing us any differences, we couldn't actually speak to why they were better at doing this. But what was interesting was when we gave them self-report questionnaires on situational awareness, there's a couple factors that play into this type of questionnaire that we used. And the factors that seem to be the biggest differentiators of, how females self-reported their situation awareness versus how males reported their situation awareness was that females tended to rate this more difficult scenario as not as challenging. And so that started to bring up a lot of other more psychological related questions, like, is it because, this is such a demanding male-dominated sector that the females that eventually make it through the ranks are just, the cream of the crop, they have this mentality that they have to be, 2 times better than their male counterparts just to make it in? Or what is the actual reason that, we're seeing these types of differences? And so I think that study was really important for shedding some insight on how there are these traditional gender assumptions that simply aren't correct in aviation. But what's important to know is that that isn't the only gender-related study that we've now run through WISA. And what we've shown in some other studies was that when we looked at, say, instructors' ratings of female trainees versus male trainees, they saw some interesting things too, where if you saw a female trainee come up, they seemed to actually get rated much harder than their male counterparts. But when we looked at the data from its simulator on how they maneuvered the aircraft, they seemed to be the exact same. So we start to see some other psychological biases playing in at the instructor level. And these are instructors that are both male and female. So it's not just male instructors showing this, it's also female instructors showing this type of bias, which is interesting. And to make this much more complex, there is a new study that we did in collaboration with York University that looked at changing the difficulty of these landing scenarios through visual illusions. So you're thinking of your black hole illusion and the false horizon illusion. And thankfully, they also did a second protocol where they looked at this particular neurocognitive difference that has been shown many, many times between male and females in that our spatial abilities do differ. So in looking at those differences in spatial abilities, how does that then impact our ability to deal with these visual illusions? And in this study, what they saw was that males did actually outperform females in their ability to manage the black hole illusion. And so that almost seems like it's contradictory to our study, but I think what's really telling is that these studies provide really objective data on things that, certain groups are strong at performing at and certain groups are weaker at performing at. And as a whole, I think what that really tells us is that there is room for new technologies to be able to objectively deduce how pilots are performing. And we should be not only implementing them, but also learning how to use that information for training purposes, because what may be a weakness in one individual may not be a weakness in another individual. And that needs to be brought up to our instructors' attentions and be able to, sort of be used to customize training in a certain way so that every single pilot can receive specific support towards their weaknesses so that they, as themselves, can be a much more well-rounded pilot. And in doing that for every single pilot, hopefully you can have a much more well-rounded and a much more resilient workforce.
Why do you think that the other study was contradictory? Because based on what you guys looked into, a reasonable conclusion could be that female students are scrutinized a little bit more heavily, and so they do push out and become the cream of the crop, and then in an emergency situation they perform better, which seems reasonable. But then there's this other study that would defy that.
So with what Aryan said, do you think that if you increase the sample size, you would be able to come up with a concrete answer that, okay, now instead of a group and a different group, we've been doing this research for 10 years and now I've got 1 million people that I've studied, and so I can say that this group is better and, that group is worse?
I think that we're going to need a lot more data to support these initial findings in general, but I think more data is going to be crucial to individualizing our ability to fine-tune training. It's not going to be a question of this group is better than that group. I think this is going to be important, going back to my point to what I said before, to having training support the individual based on their individual needs. And that will make a much more well-rounded and resilient workforce in general, because by cutting out people based on their group because they're not able to perform to the same level in a specific type of task doesn't seem like the right way forward, especially in a time where we have, these great workforce challenges that we're kind of up against, like pilot shortages. It just doesn't make sense. Back to this other question of why this other study showed a different, outcome. The way that they made up their scenario with the visual illusions really focused in on the well-known gender differences that we know. So males are better able to deal with, say, mental rotation than females. That's cut and simple. We know that from a number of different neuroscience studies. And so having a task that specifically changed the mental rotation required to successfully perform a landing, such as the visual illusions that were done, that was nicely tied to a cognitive capability that has known roots in gender differences that were expected. With the landing emergency that we used in our study, it didn't really touch on mental rotation or different spatial capabilities. That seemed like our study seemed much more complex in the number of different underlying neurocognitive capabilities that, basically underlie our ability to make sense of the hazard, do what needs to be done in a timely manner, and then land the aircraft. So there are a number of different factors that play into that versus the visual illusion scenario. And I think that's why there was such a difference in what we found. I think, once again, it goes back to requiring much more data. If we have 1 million participants come in and do 1 million different scenarios, I think that'll be very telling of a lot of the gender differences and other differences amongst other different types of groups that are definitely important to uncover, but then to use that data appropriately to make the best positive decisions for the aviation workforce going forward, I think is going to be the biggest thing that we're going to have to tackle after that.
And can you define mental rotation?
Mental rotation is basically a spatial ability to mentally rotate stimuli in your mind. So it relies on your working memory to basically hold, like, if you can think of like a Lego block, if you put a couple of Lego blocks together and you turn it in a specific rotation and ask somebody of all these other Lego block configurations which one matches, your ability to rotate that original Lego block in your mind, males are able to do that much better than females.
Although I'm bummed that your research, the eye tracking research, didn't disprove the hypothesis, and then, I'm not able to say that, one gender is better than the other. I actually think it's important that it did that, because it goes to show that one group, like you said, is not better than another group, which does then open up so many more questions and doors for the gender disparity within the workforce. So I think, at least with what our organization is trying to uncover and trying to kind of do better in, I think that it's really unique and incredible. I'm actually curious to know what research made that study, the study that you guys were looking at, made that hypothesis that you would have expected to see women have a greater sense of broad acuity and tracking. What kind of went into that?
So there have been a couple of studies that have looked at gender differences in visual search tasks. And visual search tasks are basically almost like a Where's Waldo type of task, where it's like, here's an environment, just look through it, see what interests you. At some point, they may ask you to identify something like a Waldo, look for Waldo. And what we've seen is that females, when they're asked to do that task, their typical scan pattern tends to be very broad and searching a bunch of different things all over in the environment, whereas males, when they're asked to do that typical type of task, they're very focused on a couple of different aspects of the environment, and that's just kind of how they look for things. But that's kind of been like all that we've been able to see in differences in gaze behavior between males and females, and that's what kind of set the precedent for our hypothesis. But obviously, a visual search task is also very different from attending to an emergency in flight. So that could be one of the reasons why we didn't see a difference in gaze behavior. Also, like within aviation, you guys know that when you're dealing with these types of things, I think there's a whole checklist in your mind of things that you have to be looking at or doing. And that may also play into the reason of why we didn't, and maybe we won't see gaze differences in that particular scenario. But it's all up in the air.
As a flight instructor, I realized that one thing I was never fully taught is how to appropriately scan the instruments. It's like you do scan and you're told to scan, but I've started now to tell my students at this point, you should look at this instrument a little bit more. At this point, you should look at this instrument a little more. And obviously, we have an instrument lesson where we talk about radial scanning, selective scanning, but that's only in instrument training. Otherwise, in VFR, you just have to kind of figure it out and do it yourself. So there's a lot of ways that this could be useful.
Yeah. There's a lot of things in aviation itself where you kind of figure that pathway yourself. Like no one tells you, like I said with that question about landings, at what point do I now stop looking inside and focus on the actual landing portion? And I've talked to, pilots that are 20,000 hours and they also can never define when that happens, but it just ends up happening at some point. So it's really interesting. Yeah, like you said.
Yeah, one of our instructors, actually, we had him on a podcast a few episodes ago, and we asked him about landings. He's a flight instructor with over 20,000 hours flight instructing, and he said that when he lands and he rotates and he does that final portion, he doesn't know where his eyes go. They go somewhere. And then it got me thinking about it. I also don't know what I look at that final stage of landing.
Maybe it's just because it's such a high task saturated portion of that you don't focus on what to focus on. It just happens. And it's also like probably the fastest task that you complete or that happens in such a short span of time that you don't realize. And it's also just so task saturated, and it's just you're looking somewhere and somehow the plane ends up on the ground and it's there.
I can't wait for you to start your flight training. I mean, you're going to start like self-analyzing it ahead of it.
But maybe we should do another episode with you, like a few months later, and see how that's changed. No, that's very interesting. I think like we've learned a lot, and especially with the studies on gender differences, I think that just speaks volumes to what we need to not only research, but how do we pair that to what we are trying to accomplish within the workforce in the future. And I think that's incredible. Kind of looking ahead, what do you see as the next frontier in applying neuroscience and sensor tech to aviation? So I know that you said just the apparatus and having it a little more applicable and available to flight training, but maybe anything else that you see going on with your research, I guess, in particular?
Well, one of the companies I consult with right now is they are integrating pretty much every novel piece of research that I have done at the University of Waterloo or some of our related collaborators have done. And that is, to use these signals to understand, when individuals are becoming overwhelmed with their training or when they're becoming too fatigued or, stressed with certain scenarios, to then identify at what task or at what sub-portion of this training module is this happening? Is this happening because you are overtraining? Because we know you guys go through a lot of training, especially at the commercial level where you're expected to do hours and hours of training within such a short period of time for every aircraft that you're supposed to be able to fly. Is it because there is a certain triggering scenario for you? Because maybe you had a very traumatic landing at one point and now trying to get back into the groove of things, there's something still impacting the way that you're flying because of that event? Or is it just, there's such a big learning curve, what I've seen with pilots coming into this, and especially pilots probably going through some of the new, ab initio to commercial pipelines that are being set up in a lot of different airlines right now, where there's a lot of training, there's a lot of different scenarios being thrown at you in the simulator, in VR, in the sky. Where are you getting overwhelmed? Because I think all those different points of data will provide really good feedback, not only from the instructor standpoint, but from even the self-learning standpoint. Is this specific flow really causing me a lot of challenge? Why is it, taking me so long to actually learn these different modules? I think all of those different types of or pieces of information are pretty important from the training and retraining perspective. And to be able to either come up with a product or come up with some type of research question that helps to improve these training pipelines, not only at the ab initio level, but at the commercial level or even at the military level where, it either costs an organization a lot of money to train somebody or it costs you guys a lot of money to get yourself through training. I think it's really important because if we can provide support in a way that helps reduce the amount of time or money or energy that goes into training and make sure that obviously you exit these training pathways at the highest quality and safety, ratings possible, I think that's all an important question, especially because aviation is such an important industry we saw in COVID. And I think, Suzanne probably comments on this more than anyone, the importance of having the aviation industry continue to work across all these different types of domains where we see that it's being used. So using the research to answer those types of questions and being applied to those types of gaps in the industry right now, I think is really important.
You mentioned machine learning briefly earlier. Are you talking about AI and its implementation within all this? Do you use AI currently as part of your research to help gather or analyze data?
Yeah, we definitely do, especially my postdoc. We're working more and more with machine learning and AI, only because, in all honesty, if we want the right applications of these tools to be provided to all you trainees across all these levels of aviation and to get the data to support, actual changes in Transport Canada, because obviously they're at the top right now and they want a lot of data before they think about making any changes to their current training protocols, because aviation is one of the safest industries out there. And they didn't do that just by, saying, hey, yeah, we'll try this and see if that improves our training pipeline. But, at the risk of safety, that's obviously not the way they work. So this all goes back to the point of, in order to get these types of insights from the data that we're collecting to, answer all these types of questions, if we relied on someone like me to process that, we would probably never get there. It's a lot of analyzing and processing of data that needs to happen. So we need machine learning and AI to take over that, so that instead of, trying to find 20,000 people like me to do this one thing, we just hand it off to the AI and it'll take care of all of that. And that will make it not only effective for trainees, but scalable so that we can go beyond just ab initiates. We can reach all types of pilots and individuals training within this space.
Yeah, we've talked about a lot of different topics so far, and I'm sure there's still a lot more that's happening behind the scenes. What advice would you want to leave all of our pilot listeners with, whether they're low time or high time for experience?
I think make sure you have in the back of your mind that you should check in with yourself every now and then. If you're becoming too hyper-focused with something, scan around, see what's going on. That's pretty beneficial at every phase of flight, I think. And the other thing, too, I think would say is be curious about the new technology out there. Be curious about its applications to training. Be curious about its applications to the way you operate an aircraft, because a lot of research is being devoted towards making your life easier right now, because we know that you guys are up there doing a million different things at once and it's demanding. And so there's a lot of people trying to make sure that you guys are also okay and continue to be trained for all the additional challenges that you're facing. Obviously, you think of climate change impacting the weather that you guys have to deal with. We're thinking about all the other different changes in automation on the flight deck, outside of the flight deck that you have to deal with, and even, the increase in air traffic, whether that's with drones or, more airplanes or anything like that. And so, yeah, just be curious about the research that's going on to make your lives easier, because that's all we're trying to do.
Honestly, hearing it from you, it puts my mind a little bit more at ease to know there's tons of people working on other things in the background that we don't even think about for a second, but all of it is bound to be extremely beneficial for pilots in aviation in the long run there.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Ayala, thank you for joining us. For any of our listeners that would like to learn more about your work or follow your research, whether they be a grad student that want to actually get involved, how can they engage with your lab or get involved or reach out to you, I guess?
I think the easiest way would be on LinkedIn. That's probably the best way to reach me. Otherwise, WISA does a very good job of keeping everyone to date on all the research they're doing. I'm still associated with that. So you can follow me there and any of the ongoing research they have there. They've got a lot of calls for participants going out from time to time. So if you are, interested in aviation or an actual pilot, there's probably a study out there for you to go and participate in.
Well, thank you very much for having this conversation with us, for making the trip all the way out here, the low IFR weather that we asked for. I think our listeners will take a lot away from this one.
We definitely are taking it.
Yeah, so they'll be excited for your post-PPL.
Sounds great. I had a great time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And to our listeners, we're wishing you blue skies until one's ahead. We'll catch you for episode 13 of the Blue Skies podcast.